Thanks for joining the Agri-Pulse Educational Webinar Series presented by the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association. Our program begins in 3 minutes.
Our program begins in 3 minutes.
Two minutes to programming. We're less than a minute away. Now, here's President of Agri-Pulse Communications, Sara Wyant.
Welcome to the second of 3 educational webinars sponsored by the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association. We're so glad that you can be with us. I'm Sara Wyant, the editor and founder of Agri-Pulse Communications, the nation's leading provider of farm and rural policy information. We're really pleased to host this important event on a very timely topic. And thanks to all of you who have joined this call to learn more about trade and international market development. As a reminder, if you have questions, we will be asking you to submit those during the course of our conversation in the Q&A window on the right-hand corner of your computer screen. Presenters will each do their best to answer your questions. However, due to time constraints, not all questions will be addressed during this webinar, and you can feel free to submit those and we'll try to follow up later. But we do hope to have lots of questions during this lively discussion. First up, you'll have 3 different distinguished speakers today, and ask your questions after they are all done. First up is Mac Marshall, who is the Vice President for Market Intelligence for the United Soybean Board and the United States Soybean Export Council. Mac works with both USB and USEC on their leadership team to evaluate and establish long-term strategic initiatives in support of advancing both domestic and international market opportunities for the U.S. soybean industry. Prior to joining USB and USEC, he served as global market analysis and trade lead at Bayer Crop Science, where he worked on international market access. Prior to that, Mac worked at Monsanto in the Global Strategy Group with a focus on commodity market analysis in support of the company's long-term strategy setting and understanding of near-term market dynamics. So Mac, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for having me, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Sarah said, I serve as our VP for Market Intelligence across the United Soybean Board and the U.S. Soybean Export Council. I'm an economist by training, so we'll go through just a couple dynamics that are going on right now as it pertains to the world of international trade for soy and international marketing. So first off, just to give everyone tuning in a flavor of how USEC is organized in the markets that we are addressing, here's an overlay of our global operations and the regions in which we operate. As you can see, if you look and reconcile that structure with global soybean trade, you can see that we're well positioned across the entire soy complex here, with the distribution of our regions well accounting for well over 90% of international soybean imports. Drilling down a little bit further, since we are talking about market development here, we've also had some strategic alignment on how we are pursuing new markets, evolving existing markets, and maintaining both access and selling into mature markets here. And you can see, again, well positioned to serve the vast majority of the world here. Over 90% of soybean imports globally are in markets that we've identified as key to our strategy. So I'm sure most, if not everyone tuning in, was looking at market developments on an ongoing basis, certainly, but last week the USDA released its August World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates to capture what the latest snapshot is for market development, both in the U.S. and internationally. On the soy side, this meant a pretty significant upward revision to yields. We're now looking at just about a record crop in the U.S. on record yields here. But given that this is a seminar on international markets, I want to drill in a little bit on what's happening on some of the other balance sheets. Significantly, and certainly China's in the news a lot, we had upward revisions to what China is demanding in terms of soy and its import behavior, which also led to a nice upward revision in expected export or whole soybean exports out of the U.S. For the 2021 marketing year. But I also want to drill in on a couple upward revisions that were happening in other markets, particularly in Egypt and Thailand, which both also saw some nice additional pull forward in demand on the animal ag side for meal and for imports. So I think to underscore a little bit more of a longer trend here, if you consider international trade of soybeans coming out of the three main exporters, U.S., Brazil, and Argentina, and you look at month-by-month shipments, you see demand is obviously continuing to grow. Import demand globally is very, very strong. China, again, is always going to be the major story as the world's largest soybean importer, but other markets definitely matter as well. If we look at that behavior in China, as far as imports, certainly recently, we see that China had reported record imports in June, which of course coincides with the peak selling season out of Brazil. Brazilian currency had been pretty cheap the first half of the year. There was a lot of forward selling, and now the crop is pretty well forward sold, Brazil being sold out for most of the year here. So now as we move into this period of late season crop development and look towards what the harvest is going to look like coming out of the U.S. and our seasonal peak for export in the fourth quarter of this calendar year, I think the open question remains, what does that look like? China's historically conducted the majority of its volume purchasing in the second half of the year, and I think if we're looking at new crop sales into China that have been pretty aggressive over the past 6-8 weeks or so, we got more good forward sales data coming out this morning. I think we can expect that pace of of demand from China to continue pretty well in the near term, which is obviously going to be supportive for the U.S. soy complex. So something definitely favorable to look at. But looking back kind of over the course of how the seasonality of international soy trade moves, this is where you can really see a little bit more of a delineation of when you have the peak seasons for the U.S. and Brazil, who are, of course, the two largest exporters of whole soybeans. So for the forthcoming marketing year, which will start on September 1st, the USDA is expecting U.S. soy exports for that whole marketing year to be about 56 million metric tons, which is a pretty substantial increase from the current marketing year. Part of that, I think, is predicated on an expectation of rebound in sales to China, and certainly the new crop sales pace that we've seen has been supportive of that. But also we've got a much larger crop this year as well, and we're definitely well positioned to serve international markets. Here you see also the pace of Brazilian exports over the course of the year. You can see we're well past where the typical seasonal peak is, but what I really want to draw everyone's attention to is that top line there for 2020 and just how much larger it is than really what the last couple years have been. This, of course, is attributable to a large crop in Brazil, but in terms of macro factors, really currency has been a pretty significant driver here as well. So if we look at the first 4 months of the season, Brazilian real depreciated nearly over 40% relative to the dollar, going to a record low, just about 5.9 real to the dollar in mid-May. And during that period, given that Brazilian farmers are receiving payment for their beans in local currency, there was record pricing that Brazilian farmers were able to sell into during that period. So there was a lot of aggressive forward selling. As I said earlier, much of the crop had already been forward sold for the year. I think as recently as June, over 93% of the crop had been sold, and naturally there's been more crush, there have been more exports since then, so just about sold out for the year, which I think, again, gives us some excitement from a U.S. perspective of what the fourth quarter here, or rather the first quarter of the new marketing year can have in store. As the real, since that mid-May period, has gained strength against the dollar, appreciating about 7% over that time, we've seen spreads widening in terms of U.S. cost favorability relative to Brazil. So here we see in this mid-August period a FOB cost, a free on board cost of sourcing out of Gulf origin relative to Brazil of about $30. So you can see the U.S. origin has just been getting cheaper and cheaper as as supply tightness has continued in Brazil, again with a lot of the forward selling having already happened, but coupled with renewed appreciation of the real against the dollar. Now, I've talked about China, I've talked about the U.S. certainly, I've talked about Brazil, but I did mention that there are a couple other spots that are worth noting in the latest WASDE, where we had some pretty significant upward revisions, not on the magnitude of a very, very large market like China, but certainly two nice markets that have evolved over the past couple of years through the work of our teams internationally across USEC. So first is Egypt here. We've seen some really tremendous growth over the past couple of years, and then if we look at our performance even relative to last year, it's been really, really strong. And that's already booked exports and sales that have already happened. So seeing those upward revisions in what Egypt is likely to demand for the forthcoming marketing year, I think provides even more enthusiasm, especially since the U.S. is the provider of choice to Egypt. Similar story in Thailand, and I think what's interesting here is you have a lot of seasonality where there's a peak buying period in that fourth quarter of the year, buying from the U.S. But we're seeing strength in sales throughout the course of the year as well. So I think particularly these past 2-3 years, as we've really worked on market expansion and development and really underscoring how the U.S. is well positioned to serve the growing feed and animal ag market in Thailand. We've actually seen that come to fruition in the data there. One of the things that we really look at as well when doing our strategic evaluation of markets and how we're going to address those, how we're going to continue to diversify end destinations for U.S. soy, we do look at demographics certainly. And if you think about the populations in Egypt and Thailand on a high level, those are populations that are poised to add tens of millions of people even over the next just 15 years. And it's not just that that's exciting. If you drill down a little bit more and you look at the urbanization rates in those countries, those both, I think, over that period are supposed to increase by 10 percentage points each, which is really exciting because as urbanization rates increase, so does per capita meat consumption, and then by extension the need for soybeans and feed to supply that. So just a quick encapsulation of where we are as a snapshot in time in terms of what's developed over this marketing year, what we can look to for the next marketing year, and then some of the trajectory that we have in some of these emerging markets that our teams are working on as well. So with that, I'd like to conclude my comments, and back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mac. I really appreciated that overview, and we look forward to having some additional discussion. As a reminder, we'd like all of you to be submitting your questions so that we can have that dialogue with Mac and our other two presenters. Now, next up, we're going to welcome Roz Leek. She's going to talk a little bit more about some of these new markets that are under development. Roz is the Senior Director for Market Access and the Regional Director for North Asia for the U.S. Soybean Export Council. She handles a lot of different issues for USEC, as you can imagine, and she has a terrific background. Prior to joining USEC, Roz served as the Director of Grain Marketing at the Indiana Corn Marketing Council and the Indiana Soybean Alliance. She brings more than 10 years of experience in the grain marketing field with previous positions at Archer Daniels Midland and Demeter LP. She's also worked for the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, serving in the Division of Soil Conservation. And Roz originally hails from Southern Illinois, where she remains an active partner in her family's grain and livestock farm. So we'd really like to welcome you, Roz, and I'll turn it over to you.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you all today. I feel very honored to be in between Mac Marshall and Liz Hare, so I appreciate this opportunity. But in listening to Sarah provide my bio, sometimes it makes me wonder if maybe I just haven't been able to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. However, I've stayed true to agriculture. It seems to be in my roots. Well, today I wanted to take a little bit of time here to talk about our organization at USEC. So Mac gave a little bit of an overview of some of the markets we're working in and what the trade looks like. But I want to take just a step back here and talk a little bit about USEC and who we represent. So the U.S. Soybean Export Council was founded in 2005 by the American Soybean Association and the United Soybean Board. So we're farmer-owned and farmer-led. However, as you can see from this collage, we represent a large portion of the agricultural sector in the United States, the soybean sector. So we have everything from farmer organizations and state checkoffs and farm bureaus to the life science companies and the technology providers, input providers to the farmers, as well as some equipment manufacturers, and ultimately the exporters. So when we're talking about the issues we're working on and how we're working in these markets, we're really talking about the entire value chain. And so it is our pleasure to be able to represent the U.S. soy industry in the international marketplace. And then just a quick note on what our focus is and what our mission is. Our objective is to differentiate and create a preference for U.S. soy around the world. So we aren't just looking at trying to trying to promote soy, that's an important part of it. In some market segments, we actually do start with just trying to get the understanding of soy. But in the end, what we really want and what our objective is for people to be making decisions based on what the intrinsic and extrinsic values of the U.S. soy product is, so that there is a preference for U.S. no matter what the situation is, and even a preference that exceeds the price comparison. And then the part that's really near and dear to my heart as the Senior Director of Market Access is ensuring that we have market access around the world and that those issues don't limit our ability to export our product. As you may imagine, that is an area that has continued to be very active, and it's been particularly active even during the times of COVID, where you might think that things would slow down and there would be some more attention paid to other issues. But in fact, we've seen a lot of non-tariff barriers emerge here over the last few years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Technology, there's the slide advance. So Mac showed this map to you early in his presentation, and so this is what our global footprint is for USEC. And as he mentioned, we kind of work across many different market segments, whether it be mature markets like Japan and Europe, where there's not a tremendous amount of overall growth. There's changes in market shares that we can work on, but as far as the market growing, it's not necessarily going to grow. That's just not the way the population is or the demand drivers are. And then we also work in the expansion market. So when you think about expansion, think of places like Egypt and China and Mexico. Those are expansion markets to where there's still tremendous opportunity to continue to grow. And then there's the emerging market space. And Liz will talk a little bit about the partnership that we have with WISH as to how we work in those emerging market spaces and what the role that WISH has, and then where we eventually, hopefully those markets grow into something that USEC will do more work in. But we do some work in emerging market space, particularly when you're talking about market access, because it's so important to have that access to the marketplace so that ultimately they can start importing product when it's necessary. And so that's one area, particularly on the African continent, where we're working very closely with WISH to ensure that our products have a favorable, or that there's a favorable regulatory environment for trade. And so that's been an area of increasing importance, and there's a little bit of a strategy behind the increasing importance in working in those emerging markets. Some of it is to try and ensure that there is a risk-appropriate, science-based regulatory structure in place, and one that takes trade into consideration. And so, as we look around the world and the different capacities and the different influencers, having that strong development in Africa and in some of these other emerging markets is so very important, because if they start from a very strong foundation on regulation, then the ability of them to have a positive and productive trade environment, not just for our products, but for their products as well, increases dramatically. Mac touched a little bit upon how we're identifying markets to work in and how we tailor our activities to the markets. I think that one thing that I like to talk about is we all are very aware of the trade war, the trade friction, and the various trade issues we've had around the world over the last few years. I think it's important to note that before that happened, while you see 80 countries on this map where we're doing activities, we had started to make sure that we were taking into consideration the diversification of the marketplace. We were very aware of the importance of the Chinese market, and it's not going to diminish in importance. China accounts for nearly 70% of global soybean trade, so you certainly have to be a participant in that market. However, we also realized that when 30% of our total production, almost half of our exports, were going to a single market, that's quite a risky endeavor. So even prior to the trade war, the trade friction, we had really been making a very conscious and strategic effort to evolve into some of these other markets and to try and identify places that we could be working to make sure that we had that appropriate market mix. Now, we know what happened once the retaliatory tariffs were put into place and we saw our exports to China dry up essentially overnight. We know that that's been a very difficult situation for the farmers and for the entire soy complex and soy sector. However, the work that we've been doing and we continue to do in some of those other markets in order to get our foot in there and to get our product in there, we aren't sure, but we feel very confident that we had lessened the impact that that trade war has had on the agricultural sector. Couldn't completely recover or couldn't completely offset the Chinese market. That's just not possible given the size of it. However, we feel like that our efforts in these emerging markets and in the expansion markets outside of China, as well as, you got to remember your friends in the mature markets, because those mature markets were really critical in being able to increase our market share. You look at some of the mature markets and we already have 70 or 80% market share, but there are others where we had opportunity for growth, and in those markets, we were able to take advantage of the environment and really promote products. So I think overall, our strategy continues to be, we're always looking for the next opportunity and for a way to make sure that U.S. soy is the supplier of choice. We work very closely with the entire sector. We also work very closely with our partners at USDA when we're dealing with the Foreign Agricultural Service. We have frequent contacts with the embassies around the world. We work closely with other cooperators, so U.S. Grains Council, U.S. Wheat Associates, NAGA. In particular, these are organizations, when we're dealing with large market access issues, it's incredibly important to have those multiple voices. And I would mention, since Mac had Thailand up there, I'll use Thailand as a quick example. Thailand's a place where there's been a lot of growth and there's still a lot of opportunity. However, we've been facing some pretty severe market access challenges there here in just the last few months. So we've been working very closely with all of our partners in the supply chain to try and provide the relevant input to have a positive outcome for trade, to enable trade to continue with the Thai industry. So thank you so much again for the opportunity. I look forward to the question and answer section. And Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz. That was very informative, and we've got some questions coming in, so you'll have a chance to expand on a few of those comments too. So next up is Liz Hare, the Executive Director of the American Soybean Association's World Initiative for Soy and Human Health. And Roz teed this up already, the important role that WISH is playing in market development. She leads the WISH's program's efforts to develop agricultural value chains in emerging markets and to build U.S. soy trade through the focus on health, nutrition, and global food security. Prior to joining WISH, Liz lived and worked throughout Latin America and also served as a policy assistant in a U.S. Senate office on Capitol Hill. Now, as many of you know, it does take a long time to develop new export markets, but Liz is planting those seeds in order to develop those new opportunities for years to come. So with that, Liz, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you all today. For those of you who are not familiar with WISH, WISH is a program of the American Soybean Association. Our mission is to improve agricultural value chains in emerging markets, creating trade and long-term demand for U.S. soy. And as both Mac and Roz alluded to earlier, the U.S. soy export strategy is divided into 4 market sector types: developing, emerging, expansion, and mature. And WISH is only active in the developing and emerging market segments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I won't read those countries to you, but you can see there which countries we are active in. And the 3 main things that we really like to highlight about our work are long-term market development, strategic partnerships, and global food security. So if you take nothing away from my presentation other than these 3 things today, that would be fabulous. The first, long-term market development, is really the focus on long-term markets. WISH is involved in creating brand new markets for U.S. soy in places where they do not exist yet. So a lot of that work is long-term, and by long-term, sometimes we mean 10 to 15 years. And the reason for that is because we are working all across agricultural value chains in these markets to try and get functioning and efficient value chains to a point where countries can become long-term trading partners. So we're very focused on capacity building, whether that's at the farm level with aquaculture or poultry farmers, and then all the way through the value chain to the end market where farmers are selling their end products. The second thing that we really focus on is strategic partnerships. This is one of WISH's greatest values. None of our work could be done without the strategic partnerships that we have across the globe. Those partnerships are what facilitates every project that we have, every activity that we engage in. We are working very closely with foreign governments, the private sector, and also representatives from the nonprofit sector in these countries to ensure that the work that we are doing is effective. And the final is global food security. We really design our projects to ensure that they are a win-win for everyone. We're creating new markets for US soybean farmers, but we're also improving food security in countries that need it most. I'm going to take a few minutes here to highlight some recent reports that have come out that really accentuate for everyone why work in these types of developing and emerging markets is so important, and why US soybean farmers continue to engage and invest in this type of work. The first is a report that recently came out from the FAO, the Agricultural Outlook Report, which notes that growth in feed consumption is mainly due to the ongoing expansion of the livestock herd and aquaculture production in low and middle income countries. The reason for that is that growth in meat consumption is projected to increase in developing regions due to high population levels and growth rates. And overall growth in the volume of meat consumption in developing countries is approximately 5 times that of developed countries, which you can see here on this slide. WISH is engaged in improved feed production activities in countries like Ghana and Senegal and Cambodia. We have a project right now in Ghana that is engaged in poultry feed production. The goal of that project is to improve the poultry value chain to a point to make chicken and eggs more available, affordable, and accessible to the growing population that is in Ghana. So as you can see, particularly with that project, that is an example of our focus on global food security and the win-win situation where US soy is being used in poultry feed in order to improve incomes for farmers so that chicken and eggs can be more affordable and available and accessible there in Ghana. The second report I want to call out is a report, the state of food and the food security and nutrition in the world. And this report notes the fact that global efforts are not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the goal to end hunger and achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. The report specifically calls out and emphasizes the importance of accelerating the production of healthy, protein-rich foods. WISH's work in countries like Nigeria and Myanmar and Guatemala and El Salvador are focused on engaging with the private sector to improve production of protein-rich foods, utilizing US soy, and making those foods more affordable and accessible to the growing population in those countries. You can see here that this slide notes that over half of the people affected by moderate or severe food insecurity in the world live in Asia, and more than 1/3 live in Africa, both regions in which WISH works. And the third report I want to take the time to note here is a report on the state of the world's fisheries and aquaculture, which notes that global fish production is estimated to have reached about 179 million tons in 2018, and aquaculture products in 2018 accounted for 52% of fish for human consumption. You can see on this slide that that number has changed dramatically from 1968, when aquaculture accounted for only 6% of fish for human consumption. So that's a dramatic change that we are looking at, we are following, and we are engaging in. The report also notes that the priority should be to further develop aquaculture in Africa and in other regions where population growth will challenge food systems most. As noted before, that's because increasing populations need increased access to protein. One of the largest projects that we have right now is an aquaculture project all across the value chain in Cambodia, focused on improved aquaculture production. And this is an example here of the various strategic partnerships that we have to help facilitate the success of that project and help make that project sustainable once the project ends. That project is funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And really, again, in the end, the goal of the project is to increase the utilization of U.S. soy in feed and ultimately make more protein more available to the growing population there in Cambodia. Sara, I'm tossing it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that overview, and thanks to all of you who are submitting your questions. So if we can have all of you available there, thank you very much, so that we can start on the Q&A portion of this webinar. One of the first questions that came in was a request to compare the U.S. and Brazil in terms of what are the differences that you see in developing relationships with politicians and with academia in terms of getting the soy export message out and the benefits of U.S. soy. So Mac, maybe if we could start with you and then have Roz contribute as well.
As far as a comparison between the U.S. and Brazil in facilitating and enabling relationships, I think in both countries here, you know, agriculture is absolutely central to economic activity and being viable exporters. So there's a vested interest really in both in terms of you know, buy-in from the academic community and buy-in from I'd say the trade and political sector as well. You know, I don't honestly have an opinion to offer in terms of like differentiating between the two. I think other than to say that you know, both countries definitely recognize the importance of international trade and doing everything they can to facilitate it.
All right, thank you. Roz, is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of just the overall importance of relationship building?
Yeah, so I'll add just a little bit. One of the things that we have is the International Soy Growers Alliance, which is an alliance of the soy producing countries. So we have Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Canada, Paraguay, United States, and Uruguay. So we cover pretty much the entire Western Hemisphere. And those relationships have been really critical on addressing pre-commercial matters. So we don't get into things that are post-commercial, but we try and deal with a lot of these challenges when you're dealing with opening markets or with dealing with non-tariff measures. So those relationships are incredibly important. While we're competitors, it's important that we work together in representing the farmers in the soy industry to try and deal with those issues. I think that from a government standpoint, it's also incredibly important and becoming increasingly so, particularly in the international fora, that producing countries such as the United States and Brazil have a close relationship and understanding of what some of the challenges are facing the farmers and the international trade. So I think that those relationships, government to government, private sector to private sector, U.S. private sector to Brazilian government, and vice versa, those are all incredibly important as we all are trying to work together to advance soy around the world and continue to have the social license for operation of farming, of modern farming.
All right, thank you. A question for you, Liz, and that is that you talked a lot about developing aquaculture, and I know that there have been different reports suggesting that perhaps we can't have these large-scale fish operations in some countries. There are some concerns about the sustainability of that. Are you facing any regulatory challenges when you're trying to develop the aquaculture industry in some of these other countries?
Roz is going to hate me for this, but as she said earlier, we really work very closely together with USEC on regulatory issues. So while we are engaged in individual market development activities, and a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of market intelligence comes from those activities and those relationships that we have on the ground when implementing a project, we do not engage specifically in market access policy issues with regard to aquaculture. However, we do, ensure that government representatives, policymakers, private sector companies are invited to the events that we hold, so we can ensure that they are aware of the benefits of U.S. soy, the reasons for utilizing U.S. soy, the reasons for using aquaculture best management practices. So while we don't engage directly in conversations with regulators about those types of issues, we do have tangential engagement through the relationships that we have, and we try to get the message out through our market development activities.
Great. Well, let's throw this back to Roz then and have her expand on that, because we also had another question from Julie Harker with Brownfield Network on, you had mentioned trade access challenges with Thailand. So can you drill down a little bit more, Roz, on some of the trade challenges that you see and the regulatory hurdles?
Sure. Well, you have to be careful, Sarah, giving me a platform to talk about market access, because I can, I'm passionate about this. I get a little bit jazzed. So specifically on the toss back from Liz. So I think that Liz was highlighting what's a critical element in any market access work or dealing with issues in country, is that the most important thing are those relationships that we have with our local partners, because we aren't a constituency in these countries. So it's important for us to have those relationships and those partnerships so that the constituents of those governments are the ones that are able to carry forward the message that helps create an understanding of what the trade issue is. And so I think that from our perspective, those relationships are incredibly important. We can provide the information and what we see as being the obstacle or the potential harm that could come from some sort of trade issue. And then they're able to take that information and build their case to go and talk with their governments. On the Thailand issue, so there's been an increasingly, let's see, how shall I say this? So there's been a move to more of a non-science-based regulatory approach on, particularly on crop protection products. And so there were a couple issues that emerged related to a couple active substances. Now, it was in the news a bit last fall, so around October, November, where glyphosate was on the docket to get chopped. And so that got a lot of attention. But at the same time, they were also talking about two other active substances, and they delayed any implementation or any change for those products. But it did ultimately come April. They started talking about it again, and they moved forward with a ban. Now, this is one of those situations where the regulatory environment in Thailand didn't take trade into consideration. So they were trying to address a local concern of not wanting their farmers to use these particular products. However, what the unintended consequence was is in their legislation, when they moved these from a certain category to a different category to ban them for use in their country, it effectively put the MRL at 0. And so that's not a trade-enabled solution. So we've been working very hard to get recognition of Codex and other international standards so that trade can continue to flow, because they are reliant on soy imports and wheat imports. And so it's incredibly important that we figure out a trade-enabled solution. So that's one of the situations where there are oftentimes many unintended consequences of something that's being dealt with domestically that ends up having a trade implication. And that's the case in Thailand. So we aren't certain what the outcome is going to be. We worked very closely with our Thai partners so that they were able to carry those messages and express the concern and the damage that would occur to their industry if they were unable to utilize imported soy. and imported wheat and other products. And so hopefully we'll have a favorable outcome that at least enables trade. But for right now, there's a little bit of uncertainty.
All right, thank you very much, Roz. It's clear to see that you're very passionate about that and trying to make these situations work for soybean farmers. So, Mac, a question for you. With your years of experience both on the crop protection side and now in your current role, what do you see as some of those, if you can prioritize your list of challenges that you're dealing with every day, what do you see as some of the biggest ones for expanding the portfolio for soybean exports from the U.S.?
Sure. I think it goes into a couple different categories. One, certainly the market access issues. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be able to develop a market if you can't get the policy environment that's needed to enable it. And that's not just, maybe policy is even the wrong word. I'd say the infrastructure environment. It's the infrastructure of having a trade enabling policy for sure. And I think Roz outlined that very well, some of the issues that we face in some acute markets. But it's also, I think, the economic infrastructure that's going to help enable it. How much is a market progressing or an individual country progressing in terms of protein development and downstream market development in which it really needs soy and needs soy meal. There's a pace going forward. I think to some of the things that Liz had laid out, particularly looking at frontier markets where protein adoption and expansion and integration into diets is certainly growing at a much faster rate, both in growth rate and absolute volumes in developing markets. But it's just a question of how far along the curve are those markets where they're going to need soy. I mean, it's a trajectory that is certainly positive for us as a whole as an industry, but we have to balance those growth rates for sure. In terms of so I'd say that's kind of the whole set of infrastructure that we look at. In terms of just year to year market development, obviously there are going to be dynamics that cause production swings from one country to another. I saw a question come in, for example, about South Africa and where that fits into our strategic alignment here. Naturally, it's a large feed formulator on the continent, but it's a country that is more or less self-reliant on domestically cultivated soybeans. So that factors into some of our calculus and strategic orientation as well. When a couple of years ago, I think in the 15-16 marketing year, South Africa had a drought and did become a little bit more reliant on imported soy and meal as well to be able to meet that demand. So I'd say there are kind of long-term structural things that we have to evaluate in terms of growth pace and how we're investing in a diversification strategy and the markets in which we want to solidly address. But there's also kind of those in-season dynamics where we need to continue to be ready, willing, and able to be the supplier, not just of availability, but of choice as well. And the quality components of U.S. soy really do become a differentiator, and the more markets that see it, certainly the better, and that helps us with the future trajectory as well.
Thank you, Mac. So just to follow up a little bit more on the questioner that had asked about South Africa, it sounds like that is not on the top of the priority list anytime soon. Is that correct?
Well, I'd say that any market where there's potential opportunity is something that is under evaluation for us. Right now it is a market that does primarily supply its own soybeans, but as going back to my point earlier, we have to look at trajectories. In some of these countries that do cultivate soybeans, there are capacity limiters in terms of agronomics and other things where it does become an inflection point where domestic supply is no longer going to supply everything that's needed, and there's a need to source externally, and we want to be well positioned to do that. So I'd say it's a constant exercise in evaluation and strategic planning.
Great, got it. So you might want to elaborate on this, but the question came in for Roz. what criteria do you use to assign different countries into these categories, like mature, expansion, and how do you structure those ratings? Roz?
Well, so I'll give it a quick shot, and then I'll turn it over to Mac. But I mean, really, the criteria kind of goes upon what Mac discussed earlier. So we look at population, we look at population growth, and the income, as well as the dietary requirements, and all of those types of things. And I mean, I think when we talk about markets and growing markets and expansion, is that our goal is that when there is an opportunity, we just want to get a piece of that action. If we can get it all, that would be great, but we want to be positioned to be able to get a piece of that action. And so that's why trying to understand the market dynamics in many of these different spaces and many of these different environments around the world is important to be able to do that. So, like I said, the analytical part of it, the quantitative part of it, I'll let Max speak to, but from an overall strategy standpoint, we just want to be part of the opportunity when it presents. Mac?
Yeah, and honestly, I think Roz's answer there really encapsulates it quite well. The one thing that I would just like to further underscore is that the approach towards market development and evaluation isn't strictly qualitative, isn't strictly quantitative. We have a mix of expertise and disciplines that come together. We can look strictly at metrics and things like market share, market opportunity, growth trajectories in terms of demographics. Those are all fantastic, but that's where our international network of our team across USEC, being able to provide those in-market bits of intelligence and feedback, as well as strictly developing relationships with with the downstream industry that is going to be reliant on soy. We want to make sure that they're well positioned to want U.S. soy as the preferred source here, and that doesn't strictly come down just to numbers. So it really is an integrated, I'd say multidisciplinary team approach here, mix of quantitative and qualitative assessments.
Great, thank you. So Michelle from FAS would like to know how ASA is incorporating the U.S. farmer into various projects in Cambodia and Southeast Asia. So I'd like to turn that over to you, Roz, and maybe Liz can give some examples as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that, Roz, if you want to toss it to me. All right. So really, farmer engagement in our projects, whether that is direct farmer engagement to visiting the projects that we are implementing, or on the strategy side of things, is extremely vital for two reasons. One of the reasons is we are doing, as I said before, long-term development work in these countries, some of which, like Nigeria and Ghana, we have been engaged in for over 10 years. So when you have investors and stakeholders asking you questions about why are you still engaged in these markets, why have you been here for 10 years and we're still not seeing large-scale exports there? Being able to bring our farmers to these markets and have them be able to see firsthand the investment that is required across the full value chain, whether that's in infrastructure, cold chain infrastructure, or at the farm level on the use of formulated feed versus home mixed feed, crop storage, and how that plays into feed utilization. Having them be able to see that firsthand really makes the long-term development conversation a reality. It's not just a conversation anymore. They can see firsthand why that investment is so important, why it takes so long, and how many different steps are involved in creating a new market for U.S. soy in these countries where there is no market currently. But they also get to see the incredible growth that's happening in these countries, both through investment and new buildings that are going up, improved road conditions, and also growing populations. And they're able to see firsthand that these reports are not coming out of nowhere. They're not just, being done by people sitting behind their desk that are making things up. This is real. And there are populations that are growing significantly that need increased access to protein, and U.S. soy can play a real role in delivering that protein to people. The second reason why it's so important is because our partners trust U.S. farmers. And they are able to build and create a level of trust with our strategic partners much quicker and much better than we can do just from a staff perspective. Having a U.S. soybean farmer sit down with an aquaculture farmer in Cambodia and talk about how their soy is grown, what they do on their farm, having them speak to food processors, human food processors, about the quality of U.S. soy, why it's sustainable, what practices they do on their farm every day that end up creating the product that ultimately reaches their shores. That is invaluable. And our farmers they're aware of that, and they volunteer on a constant basis to go to these markets and really tell people their story. Tell people the story about what they're growing, why they're growing it, and why they want to be a part of getting that product to these new markets. And so I think, having farmers engaged in these markets is absolutely fundamental. It's something that farmers are committed to and something that we want to see continue, hopefully here in the future when we can all see each other face to face again.
Yes, we're certainly looking forward to that time, aren't we? And in the interest of full disclosure, I've had the great opportunity to travel with some of the farmer leaders as they've watched some of these market development activities, especially as we went into Jordan and looked at some of the enhancements that are happening with the poultry operations. And it's just really exciting to see the market development that you folks are also passionate about. Roz, I was just going to call on you to talk a little bit more and elaborate on some of Liz's comments about how you view farmer engagement.
Well, certainly for us, it's the same thing. I mean, farmers are the best ambassadors for U.S. soy that there are. They are passionate about the product. They have the knowledge, and it makes it real for our customers when they can talk to somebody who's actually producing the crop. It's one thing for me or for any of my colleagues around the world to talk about the merits of soy and how great our farmers are and how conscientious they are about environmental issues, social issues, and the overall economic struggles. But for a farmer to be there and to talk about their family and the legacy and everything that goes into U.S. agriculture is the most powerful message we can convey. And it's vitally important for our partnerships. During these times, we've had to adjust how we engage and how we get our farmers to engage with our customers. And so we've been embarking on a number of different strategies to do that. We've been doing a number of global conference type activities, but we've been also doing more targeted, similar to what we would be doing if we were going in country and setting up meetings with different key stakeholders in order to have that kind of ongoing interaction. Even though we aren't shaking hands, we're at least able to sit together, usually at kind of odd times because of where we're working around the world. But nevertheless, we're still able to maintain that relationship and that connection between our U.S. soy farmers and our international customers, which is so very important to the work we do. So thank you for the opportunity to kind of share a little bit more, because I think that that's what Liz was saying as well, and it's so important regardless of which market stage you're in.
Thank you, Liz. And another question for you. And I know that so many of these activities are long-term and probably difficult for those of us who don't have patience for a lot of things, but it does really take several years, I know. Someone wants to have you elaborate on how long WISH has been working in some of the frontier markets and what you're seeing as progress.
Yeah, so like I said before, Nigeria and Ghana, we've been there for over 10 years. Cambodia, we have been engaged in for about 5 years, but recently engaged at a much higher rate through this aquaculture project. Places like Central American food sector, we have been engaged there for over 5 years, and we have seen that sector grow dramatically due to income changes happening in Central America, and a growing demand for increased grab-and-go type health food type products that U.S. soy plays a key role in. But I think the important thing to note is that every country, and Roz and Mac would tell you the same thing, every country is different. And we often get asked, could you provide us with a model kind of timeline of what you do in every country? And we could provide you with the general model timeline, but the fact is that every separate country would have little offshoots that went all different ways depending on what country that you're in. And some of that is because of regulatory reasons. Some of it is because of infrastructure reasons. Some of it is because of security reasons in countries that we work in. So really, it's very country-based and even sometimes sector-based, depending on what country that we're in. We work very closely with USEC to determine, there may be countries like Nigeria where the poultry sector is large enough and established enough to be moving into an expansion market stage. But there are other sectors in that country like food and aquaculture that aren't there. And that's for cold chain reasons or, very specific reasons, but each country has a very different trajectory that we follow, which plays into how long it ultimately takes to build that market. And sometimes we think we have the formula down and something happens in that country that we did not think was going to happen, or we did not anticipate, and we have to change the strategy, which we're all very familiar with in these past 6 months for sure.
Thank you. And just as we're winding down here, I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but we did have someone ask Liz quickly about the composition of U.S. soy as a selling point in this aquaculture industries, and you go to these other countries. Could you just touch briefly on the benefits of U.S. soy?
Yeah, let me touch briefly on the developing countries and aquaculture and why U.S. soy and feed matters there, and then I'll either let Roz or Mac talk about the actual intrinsic value of U.S. soy. But and this is a perfect example of the difference between WISH and USEC. WISH in our developing and emerging markets, we are not at the level of comparing U.S. soy to Brazilian soy in terms of intrinsic quality when we first start with some of our strategic partners. What we are trying to do is convince some of the farmers that we work with that the use of U.S. soy in formulated feed, while it costs more at the beginning, is going to end up making them more money at the end. And so it is a very basic economic process that we go through in trying to help explain to the farmers and help show the farmers through feed demonstrations and other things why the usage of formulated feed utilizing U.S. soy is going to ultimately make them more money. And that's something that we have to be sure that they understand if we want them to really invest in this feed. Feed can be up to 70% of production costs. And so farmers are very interested in ways that they can reduce their feed costs. And so we are at a very, very basic level of trying to convince people that the use of formulated feed matters and why it matters. And I will let Roz and Mac talk about intrinsic value of U.S. soy from there.
Great. Roz, why don't you just, if you could wrap up, we're just at the end of our time here, but I'll let you have the closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'll try and be super brief. I mean, Liz really started on it. It's about, there's an economic argument. So U.S. soy has a superior nutritional bundle. So when you're dealing with it in the feed formulation, it's a superior nutritional bundle that economically makes sense, even though oftentimes it's more expensive. But in the long run, it actually, it actually results in better economic outcomes. We have a new tool that we're using that actually even shows that. So you can plug in the feed formulation and it shows what the economic benefit is to using U.S. soy versus other origins, even if it's more expensive. But it's not just about economics. When you're talking about whole soybeans, we have advantages on processing too, because the refining of U.S. soybean oil, oil derived from U.S. soybeans, is actually more economic and easier to do and results in a better product than what you're able to get from South America. There are a number of different reasons why that's the case. And you know, I could go on about that for days. But then you've got, so those very clear intrinsic values, but then you've got the extrinsic values of U.S. soy too. You've got sustainability, whereas our farmers do it as the best they can in the world, and they're continuous improving. So that's an opportunity we have. You've got our reliable infrastructure, and while it has some deficiencies, and we're always looking to improve it, compared to the rest of the world, it's still the most reliable and efficient system. And then we have the constant strive. We constantly are striving for innovation, and I think that those factors also help us position U.S. soy. So from that standpoint, I could talk about it for days, but from that standpoint, that's what we look at, and that's how we're able to market U.S. soy. Thank you, Sarah.
Great. Well, I know that there's a lot more we could keep talking about in terms of all the benefits and the hard work that soybean farmers in this country are doing to try to feed the world. But we have run out of time, and I just want to thank all of you again for terrific presentations, and also to remind everybody that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available after the fact to watch the recording. And we are partnering with the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association on one more webinar that will be coming up on September 24th. That one will focus on the U.S. infrastructure challenges. We all know that it's wonderful to be able to produce these great soybean products, but we have to get it out the door and be able to export competitively. And so the next webinar is September 24th. We'll focus on those infrastructure issues as they apply to export channels. And I hope all of you will join us again at that time. Thanks again for joining us for this Agri-Pulse educational webinar. And thank you again to USB and American Soybean Association for your sponsorship. Have a great day.